It began in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the strained hush of a family dinner table where truths were forbidden to breathe. The boy stared across the table at a father who never smiled and a mother who smiled too much. Fred Trump didn't waste words on affection. He measured success in dominance, and failure in the same breath as shame. His children were not raised, they were engineered. Donald sat stiffly at attention in the grand but sterile dining room of the Trump family home in Queens, where cold formality masked the rot beneath the gold fixtures. Fred was a builder of empires, of course. But not the kind you admired. His world was brick and corruption, steel and intimidation, built not with dreams but with deals made behind doors the public would never open. Donald was the fourth of 5 children, but from the start, Fred singled him out. Not out of favoritism, but necessity. His eldest son, Freddie, had failed. Sensitive, artistic, gentle. In Fred's eyes, weak. Fred had tried to hammer the softness out of Freddie, but the boy broke instead, retreating into alcohol and sorrow, dying young and forgotten. Donald had seen this. He had seen what weakness bought you. And he vowed he would never make the same mistake. Fred noticed. And he molded Donald accordingly. Cold lessons came dressed as business opportunities. Mockery replaced guidance. The other siblings were left to orbit, while Donald was pulled into the gravitational center of a father whose gaze never let up. When other children played, Donald was ordered to watch Fred collect rent from frightened tenants or stand silently as his father refused housing to black families, always with a lawyer's smile and a whisper of legal immunity. There was no love in the Trump household. There was only performance. When Donald misbehaved in school, Fred didn't scold him. He sent him away. At 13, Donald was shipped to the New York Military Academy, not for discipline, but because, as Fred said, you're a killer. And killers need uniforms. The words landed like medals. Donald wore them proudly. But what no one saw, what Donald would never allow anyone to see, was the night he stood at his dorm room window, watching the woods beyond the academy grounds sway in the dark, wondering if this was punishment or a promotion. He didn't cry. He didn't know how. Instead, he promised himself something far colder: I'll rise so high, no one will ever send me away again. He began to learn that winning wasn't about being right. It was about never admitting wrong. That truth was for the weak. And that charm, when weaponized, could buy silence and open doors no kindness ever could. Donald would later say that his father was very smart and that he taught him everything. But the truth buried beneath the praise was darker. Fred taught Donald how to build facades that held up even when the foundation was cracking. How to speak with conviction even when he believed nothing. How to turn shame into spectacle and rage into applause. And above all, he taught him that the world only respected one thing: power. But what if the foundation of your power was the rotting wood of a family secret you never dared speak aloud? Because Freddie hadn't just died. He had been erased. And Donald had watched it happen. Years later, at ribbon cuttings and political rallies, Donald Trump would flash the practice smile, the one that made crowds cheer and adversaries recoil. But behind that smile lingered a memory that never aged: the last time he saw Freddie alive. It was at Jamaica Hospital. Freddie's hands trembled when he lifted the styrofoam coffee cup. His skin was pale, bruised with liver spots, and he looked older than their father. He wasn't even 40. Donald stood awkwardly at the edge of the hospital room, still a young man, already in a suit. Already a mirror of Fred. Freddie tried to talk, his voice raspy from years of gin and regret. He said something about how Donald should be different. That being feared wasn't the same as being respected. That their father had made a mistake. Donald interrupted him. Said something sharp, something rehearsed. something Fred would have approved of. And when Donald walked out, he didn't look back. Later, he would tell reporters he wished Freddie had listened more. That he had a great future, but couldn't handle it. But what he never said, what he never could say, was that Freddie had once been everything Fred had wanted in a son. And that Donald had only become the chosen one because his brother had fallen too far to compete. This ghost would follow Donald into every deal he signed, every camera he faced. A silent echo behind the applause. You weren't supposed to hear it. But if you looked close, if you listened during those rare moments when the spotlight dimmed, you could almost sense it, the nagging fear that he was a replacement, not a success. When Donald took over the family business, the name changed instantly. Fred C. Trump and Son became the Trump Organization. Fred was still alive, but already erased from the masthead. And Donald, driven not by greed, but by something darker, began building not a business empire, but a monument to denial. It wasn't just skyscrapers he erected, it was myth. Towering lies with marble lobbies. The family name became a brand, and the brand became armor. He put his name on everything: hotels, casinos, bottled water, steaks. Because if your name was everywhere, maybe it would drown out the sound of everything you tried to forget. In Atlantic City, he built casinos with gold-colored windows and gaudy chandeliers. But behind the glamour, the books bled. Contractors went unpaid. Workers laid off without notice. The empire was rotten at the root, but Donald made failure look like strategy. He called bankruptcies tools. He called debt leverage. And he called himself a genius for walking away from the carnage his empire left behind. But not everyone could walk away. By the early 1990s, Fred Trump, then in his 80s, was watching his son's empire crumble behind the headlines. And quietly, Fred began pumping money into Donald's failing ventures. Millions in disguised loans. Inflated invoices. Cash funneled through shady mechanisms. Not to save Donald, but to save the family name. The old patriarch, once ruthless in his rejection of weakness, now became its enabler. When reporters uncovered these financial entanglements decades later, they called it tax schemes. But the truth was simpler and sadder. It was a father covering for the only son he had left. A father who knew the empire he'd built had passed to a man with no interest in legacy, only in image. The cruelty of it is hard to miss. Freddie died trying to escape the shadow of their father. Donald lived trying to become it. And Fred, who had ruined one son by rejecting him, may have destroyed the other by embracing him too tightly. By the time Fred died in 1999, he no longer recognized anyone. Alzheimer's had taken everything, including, perhaps mercifully, the knowledge of how far his son had truly fallen. At his funeral, Donald delivered a eulogy that was as polished as it was hollow. He spoke of business lessons and hard work. He didn't mention the tenants turned away because of the color of their skin. He didn't mention the lawsuits or the payments for the buildings falling into disrepair. He didn't mention Freddie. But if you looked closely, you might have seen the tremor in his hand. It wasn't grief. It was fear. That the cracks were finally showing. And that the man he had spent his life trying to become had never really existed. By the early 2000s, the name Trump had become more than a name. It was a spell, repeated on billboards and whispered in boardrooms, meant to summon prestige where substance was missing. Like a golden mask over a hollow statue, it dazzled, deflected, and deceived. But underneath, the foundation remained cracked, just as it had been in Queens, just as it had been in that hospital room where a brother faded into silence. The family's secrets did not vanish. They adapted. They grew into the walls of marble lobbies and reality TV sets, hiding in plain sight. Donald Trump was now America's showman. Not a politician, not yet, but something perhaps more dangerous. A brand who believed his own commercials. His face became a fixture on television, and when he launched The Apprentice, he introduced a new version of himself, not the over-leveraged casino baron, but the all-knowing patriarch of power. In each episode, he played judge, jury, and executioner, an echo of Fred's dinner table lessons dressed up for prime time. It was theater, of course. But the audience didn't care. The lines between fact and performance had long since blurred. He wasn't selling ideas, he was selling dominance. Confidence without conscience. The dream of becoming untouchable. And in America, that sells. But as his fame rose, so too did the weight of everything he'd buried. In 2018, a New York Times investigation unearthed what the family had spent decades trying to keep hidden. Through a meticulous dissection of tax records, interviews, and corporate filings, the public was finally introduced to the truth. Fred Trump had transferred over $400 million in today's money to Donald, through a series of backdoor methods designed to dodge taxes and scrutiny. Fred, the man who had claimed his son was a self-made titan, had in reality engineered Donald's ascent with quiet injections of wealth, falsified invoices, shell companies, loans that never had to be repaid. The myth of the self-made man began to crack like a porcelain mask dropped in a quiet hallway. Worse still, the investigation revealed that Donald had helped craft the scheme. He hadn't just inherited the money, he'd collaborated in its concealment. This wasn't just a son leaning on his father. It was a son learning how to cheat from a master, then improving the technique. The Trump family had built their fortune the way a magician builds illusions, with sleight of hand, distraction, and ruthless precision. While the world watched the flash of gold, no one noticed the vanishings underneath, tax dollars stolen from schools, roads, and hospitals. Invisible costs paid by strangers who never knew the names on the deeds above them. But perhaps the most disturbing part wasn't the scheme itself. It was how little it surprised anyone. America, by then, had grown used to these stories. Corruption was a recurring thunderclap. And Donald, with his smirk and shrug, knew it. He leaned into the role of the unpunished. The untouchable. The man who could say the quiet part out loud, and rise anyway. Yet something had changed. The deeper the world looked, the more the ghost surfaced. Donald had always controlled his narrative. But this time, the facts were not his to spin. The Times report wasn't an op-ed. It wasn't politics. It was math. Cold, unblinking, unforgiving. Like the numbers on Freddie's death certificate. Like the final line of a will Fred may have edited too many times to count. The American dream, as sold by the Trump family, had always been a sleight of hand. It wasn't a ladder, it was a trapdoor. One that dropped you not into prosperity, but into debt, into lawsuits, into a cult of personality that devoured truth and spat out television ratings. And now, for the first time in decades, people began asking out loud, if he lied about this, what else? The illusions were faltering. The mask was slipping. But what lay beneath was not empty. It was worse. It was familiar. The face of a boy who had once stood silently at a hospital door, watching a brother disappear into the fog, and learning, in that moment, that survival meant becoming the storm that swallowed others whole. The storm would reach Washington. In 2016, Donald Trump did not enter politics. He crashed into it. A billionaire branded in bronze, riding the machinery of grievance and spectacle, a figure so entangled in myth that truth couldn't catch up. He spoke not like a politician, but like a bruised ego with a microphone. And somehow, that was exactly what millions had been waiting for. He didn't ascend to the presidency. He bulldozed his way there, dragging every family's secret behind him like luggage wrapped in gold foil. And yet the American public, so often cynical, did not flinch. They knew he had lied. Knew he had failed upward. Knew the casinos had collapsed, the workers were unpaid, the students of Trump University scammed. But that was the point. He was the man who got away with it. In a country that often rewards the bold over the good, Donald Trump was both mirror and monster. But the White House does not bend easily to myth. Its walls remember. And the moment he stepped into the Oval Office, the ghosts of his family's past came with him. The silencing. The erasures. The generational blueprint for betrayal. At first, he played the part, signing orders, commanding cameras, flanked by flags and family. But those closest to him noticed the patterns. He didn't trust anyone. Not fully. He demanded loyalty, not advice. Admiration, not accountability. And his inner circle bent to his will the way a family might bend around a domineering father, until, one by one, they snapped. Cabinet members cycled out like disposable parts. Those who stayed either feared him or mirrored him. And through it all, his children orbited like moons around a dying star, each one groomed to protect the brand, not the country. Ivanka smiled through silence. Don Jr. tweeted with rage. Eric remained background noise. They were not advisors. They were extensions. And in this strange American monarchy, they serve not a constitution, but a bloodline. It was no accident. Because this had always been the Trump formula: protect the name, whatever it takes. Whether on a building or a ballot. But the presidency, unlike the family business, had records. Leaks. Oversight, at least on paper. And slowly, the scaffolding began to tremble. Behind the scenes, Donald seemed to relive his own father's contradictions. He lavished praise on loyalty, then discarded those closest to him. He appointed people who reminded him of himself, then destroyed them when they disappointed him. His rhetoric grew darker, his paranoia sharper. And in the quiet moments, when the crowds were gone, when the lights dimmed, those who worked closest to him would say there was a different Donald. One who ranted not about the future, but about betrayal. About the media. About the institutions. About his enemies, real or imagined. He once told an aide, "They're all going to turn on me." Just like they did to Nixon. He meant it as strategy. But his voice had the weight of prophecy. The more power he gained, the more fragile he seemed. The boy from Queens who had been taught never to cry had become the man who could not stop demanding to be seen. Not loved, seen. Admired. Feared. Obeyed. When he lost the 2020 election, he didn't just contest it. He denied its reality. Because losing was not in the script Fred had written. And losing meant weakness. And weakness, he had been taught, meant erasure. It was no surprise that Donald turned the institutions of democracy against themselves. That he summoned crowds to march. That he watched, silent and unmoving, as the Capitol was breached. What shocked America wasn't the chaos. It was how familiar it all felt. The hollow confidence. The showmanship. The gold-leaf lies collapsing into something far more dangerous. This wasn't just the end of a presidency. It was the culmination of a family doctrine built on denial, survival, and control. Fred's ghost stood tall in those final days. Not in name. In form. In the decisions Donald made, not as a president, but as a son. A son still trying to impress a father no longer there to applaud. And the irony was vicious. Because in trying to preserve the family name, he may have sealed its darkest legacy. The final days were not a fall. They were a reckoning. In the days after January 6, 2021, as the smoke cleared and the headlines screamed, Donald Trump stood in the White House residence, isolated behind layers of loyalty and silence. Outside, allies distanced themselves. Inside, aides whispered of invoking the 25th Amendment. The brand had cracked, and for the first time in his life, Donald was forced to confront something he had never truly believed existed: consequence. He didn't rage. He stewed. Those closest said he wandered the halls like a man betrayed. But it wasn't the rioters who breached the Capitol he blamed. It was those who refused to defend him after. Pence, McConnell, the media, the courts, democracy itself. In those hours, he was no longer the President of the United States. He was the son of Fred Trump. Alone, misunderstood, refusing to yield. And it was in that silence that the full weight of the family story revealed itself. Donald had once said he never read books because he didn't need to. He trusted instinct. But if someone had forced him to read a single Greek tragedy, he might have recognized the arc. The boy raised to emulate a king becomes the tyrant his father feared. The one spared from judgment invites his own undoing. He might have seen the warning in Freddie's absence, the lesson in his father's coldness, the irony in building a golden tower on a foundation of borrowed bricks. But Donald never looked back. Never paused. Because looking back meant facing what he had erased. He'd erased Freddie. He'd erased his father's tenants and their grievances. He'd erased the stories of those he bankrupted, the immigrants he demonized, the women he dismissed. He tried to erase a national election. But what he could never erase was this: that he was not a man who defied the system. He was the system. He was the final echo of a century-long tradition in American power, a tradition where wealth replaced wisdom, and image replaced truth. He did not break the mold. He revealed it. He showed America what it looked like when a boy was raised not to lead, but to conquer. Not to feel, but to dominate. Not to think, but to win. And when it all came undone, he had no tools left but blame. No vision but vengeance. By 2023, he stood indicted, 4 times over. A former president, now a criminal defendant. Yet still, millions followed. Still, he held rallies. Still, he wielded power, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented, the possibility that cruelty could still be mistaken for strength. The American public, jaded and fractured, stared at him and saw a reflection. Not of greatness, but of what they had tolerated for too long. Some pitied him. Some feared him. Some still worshipped him. But the truth was this: Donald Trump had never wanted to lead a country. He wanted to be the empire. A name on buildings. A face on screens. A legacy etched not in law, but in myth. And like all myths, it demanded sacrifice. He sacrificed his brother. He sacrificed truth. And, in the end, he may have sacrificed the very idea of American dignity. So we ask now, not just as voters, or critics, or historians, but as human beings. How would it feel to live as him? To be a man sculpted in someone else's image. To be applauded for winning, but never taught why it mattered. Was he a product of his time, or a warning of what could come again? Do we fear him? Pity him? Or do we finally see him, asterisk, as a man who inherited more than money? He inherited silence, pressure, ghosts. And when they called it the American dream, he believed them. But in chasing it, he turned it into a nightmare. What if he had lived longer in power? How much worse could it have become?